Look, I need to tell you about something that happened to me in 1969, and I warn you now. What I'm about to say doesn't fit into any box the military wanted it to fit in. But I was there. I heard it. And a few years back, a buddy of mine at the National Archives pulled up some old recordings and proved that something in that valley knew what was going to happen before it happened. I still wake up at night hearing that voice, Bones's voice, calling from a cave full of dead men, telling me help was coming, when the only help on the way was the kind that blows you off the face of the earth. Let me take you back to the beginning, back to the Central Highlands, when the rain was a living thing and I was 20 years old and stupid enough to think I understood how the world worked. The only thing keeping a 6-man long-range reconnaissance patrol tethered to this earth is a 25-pound block of metal and batteries strapped to a man's back. When you get dropped miles beyond the wire, deep into triple canopy jungle where the sunlight barely touches the ground, you don't have armor. You don't have artillery pre-sighted on your position. You got stealth, you got the rifle in your hands, and you got the PRC-77 radio. That radio is your lifeline. It's the voice of God. It's the only reason you aren't just a ghost waiting to happen. If the radio goes down, you don't exist anymore. And if the radio starts talking when it shouldn't, you pray to whatever you believe in that it's just the enemy playing tricks on you. Because the alternative is something you can't fight with a rifle. It was late autumn, 1969. Monsoon season was in full swing across the Central Highlands. The rain didn't just fall, it existed as a permanent, suffocating physical presence. It washed out roads, grounded the helicopters half the time, and turned the valleys near the Cambodian border into a primordial soup of red mud and rotting vegetation. I was a sergeant, a team leader for a 6-man LRRP element designated 2 Alpha. My guys called me Huck. We operated out of a firebase that was essentially a scar of red dirt and sandbags carved into a hilltop, surrounded by an ocean of hostile green. At 3 a.m., the Tactical Operations Center, the TOC, was the only place on the firebase that felt somewhat alive. It was a large bunker constructed of heavy timbers and layers of sandbags, smelling permanently of stale coffee, damp canvas, ozone from the radio banks, and the unwashed sweat of stressed men. The generators outside provided a steady, vibrating hum that you felt in your teeth. I was sitting on a folding chair near the primary comms desk, nursing a mug of something that tasted like battery acid, trying to shake off the lingering chills of a malaria bout that had kept me inside the wire for the last 3 weeks. The primary frequency was a wash of white noise and static squelch. The radio operator on duty, a kid who looked like he should be studying for a high school geometry test, was staring blankly at the map board. Then, the static broke. It wasn't a loud transmission. It didn't punch through the squelch with the urgency of a team in a firefight. It was a whisper, a calm, measured whisper, perfectly formatted, cutting through the atmospheric hiss. TOC. This is Vagabond. Sitrep follows. Over. The radio operator froze, his hand hovering over the handset. The coffee in my mug suddenly felt like ice water in my stomach. I stood up, the chair scraping loudly against the plywood floor. The duty officer, a first lieutenant, stepped out from behind the acetate map board, his face draining of color. Vagabond was the call sign for Team 1 X-Ray. They had been inserted into a deep valley near the border exactly 5 days ago. 3 days ago, they had missed their scheduled check-in. 2 days ago, a visual reconnaissance flight had flown over their last known grid and seen nothing but unbroken canopy. Yesterday, they had officially been declared missing, presumed dead or captured. The radio operator looked at the lieutenant, terrified to touch the handset. The lieutenant nodded, swallowing hard. The kid keyed the mic. "Vagabond. This is TOC. Authenticate." We waited. The static hissed. 10 seconds. 20. In the jungle, 20 seconds of dead air feels like an eternity. TOC. Vagabond. Authentication Romeo Niner. We are holding at phase line blue. Weather is heavy. No contact. Over. The authentication code was correct. The voice was calm, almost bored. It was Bones, the team leader for 1 X-Ray. I knew that voice as well as I knew my own. We had gone through training together. The only reason Bones was out there in the mud and I was sitting in a dry bunker was because my blood had boiled with a malaria parasite the week before the rotation. Bones had taken my slot. He had taken my patrol. For 3 days, I had been living with the quiet, crushing guilt that he had died in my place. And now, he was on the net, reporting a routine situation update like he hadn't been missing for nearly a week. Captain Caldwell came out of his makeshift office at the back of the TOC. Caldwell was a good officer, but the last 6 months had aged him a decade. The skin around his eyes was dark and bruised looking from lack of sleep, and the responsibility of sending men into the meat grinder was slowly eating him alive from the inside out. He walked straight to the map board, grabbing a grease pencil. "Get a fix on that signal," Caldwell ordered, his voice tight. "Where the hell are they broadcasting from?" The radio operator worked the dials, coordinating with the relay stations on the neighboring fire bases. After a few tense minutes, he marked an X on the acetate covering the map. I walked over and looked at the grid square. It was deep inside a nameless, steep-sided valley about 15 clicks from the border. The contour lines on the map were stacked so tightly together, they looked like solid black ink. It was a gorge, essentially. A massive, deep bowl carved into the earth, choked with triple canopy. I leaned closer to the map. Near the bottom edge of the grid, printed in faint, faded lettering beneath the modern topographical markings, were words in French. The map was based on old colonial surveys from the 1950s. I translated the phrasing in my head. "Zone of navigational anomalies." "That's a dead zone," I said, pointing at the X. "The terrain is a bowl. The canopy is too thick. You can't get a clear line of sight for a VHF signal out of that valley. We've always bypassed it because comms drop the second you step foot off the ridge." "Well, they're broadcasting from it right now, Sergeant," Caldwell said, his eyes fixed on the X. He wanted to believe it. He needed to believe it. He couldn't afford to write off 6 more men. "They're alive. They're stuck in the mud. Maybe they had equipment failure. Maybe they've been evading a patrol. But they are alive." I didn't say anything, but something felt wrong. A knot was forming at the base of my spine. I knew Bones. Bones was a professional, but he also had a nervous tic. Whenever he was on the radio, he always double-tapped the handset button before he spoke. It was a subconscious habit. Click, click, then his voice. It was a signature. The transmission we just heard was perfectly smooth. No double click, just the voice. "Huck," Caldwell said, turning to me. "Spin up 2 Alpha. You're going in. I want you at the insertion point by first light. You find Vagabond, and you bring them home." "Yes, sir," I said. There was no other answer. I left the TOC and walked through the driving rain to our team hooch. It was a long, low tent reinforced with sandbags, smelling of wet canvas, gun oil, and mold. I woke my guys up. You don't yell to wake up an LRRP team. You just touch their boots, and they are instantly awake. eyes open, hands reaching for their rifles. I gathered them around a small battery-powered lantern. There was Doc, our medic, a draftee from Ohio who looked at the entire war with a deep, cynical skepticism, constantly rationalizing the madness around us with medical logic. And there was Sparks, Corporal Vernon Teague. Sparks was 19 years old, thin as a rail, and carried our PRC-77. He didn't just operate the radio, he understood it on a molecular level. He had a musician's ear for static, frequencies, and voice patterns. He treated that heavy green box like it was his own child. I gave them the brief. Vagabond was alive. We were going in to pull them out. Doc shook his head, already packing extra morphine syrettes into his aid bag. It's a trap, Huck. You know it's a trap. 5 days missing, and suddenly they pop up on the net for a routine sitrep? The NVA wiped them out, took the radio, and now they're using it to bait a rescue bird. The voice was Bones, I said, though the lack of the double click still nagged at me. It wasn't a recording. It was clear. Sparks was checking the battery connections on his PRC-77, his brow furrowed. That valley is a nightmare for signal propagation, Sergeant, he said quietly, not looking up from his work. The atmospheric pressure in a bowl like that, combined with the sheer rock walls and the moisture in the air. It creates bounces, ghost signals, echoes. Radio waves hit the rock and fold back on themselves. You can hear a transmission from a mile away, or you can pick up a signal from across the country that bounced off the ionosphere just right. But getting a clean, direct line to the TOC from the bottom of that gorge, it defies the physics of the equipment. Can they transmit or not, Sparks? I asked. They did, Sparks replied, securing the heavy battery box. I'm just saying, the signal shouldn't be that clean. Not from down there. We go in assuming it's a trap, I said, looking at the rest of the team. We move slow, we move quiet. If it's the NVA using Bones's radio, we find them, we neutralize them, and we get Vagabond's tags. If it is Bones, we get them out. Wheels up in 2 hours. The insertion was a standard slick ride, a single UH-1 Huey, flying low and fast over the treetops, the doors pinned back. The rain was coming down in sheets, stinging my face as I sat on the edge of the deck, my legs hanging out over the skids. The smell of aviation fuel, mixed with the heavy, rotting scent of the jungle rising up to meet us. Below, the canopy was a solid, unbroken ocean of dark green. It looked like an alien planet. It looked like a place that could swallow an army and leave no trace. We didn't land. The pilot found a small break in the canopy along a ridgeline above the valley, hovered 10 feet off the deck, and we jumped. The moment the chopper banked away and the sound of the rotors faded into the distance, the reality of the jungle slammed into us. It was twilight under the triple canopy, even though it was barely morning. The light that did make it through was filtered and sickly green. The air was so thick with moisture you had to chew it before you breathed it. We formed up in a standard patrol line, 5 to 10 meters apart, depending on the density of the brush. I took the point. Sparks was right behind me, the long whip antenna of his radio tied down to his rucksack so it wouldn't snag on the vines. Doc was in the middle. We moved at a glacial pace. In this kind of terrain, you don't hike. You place one foot down, roll your weight onto it, pause, listen, and then move the next foot. Every shadow could be a sniper spider hole. Every hanging vine could be a tripwire for a command-detonated artillery shell. But as we began our descent down the steep, muddy wall of the valley, toward the grid square where Vagabond had broadcasted from, I noticed something that made the hair on my arm stand up. It was quiet. I don't mean the absence of human noise. I mean the absence of everything. The jungle is usually deafening. It is a constant, screaming wall of sound. Cicadas that sound like buzz saws, frogs, birds, the rustle of macaques in the high branches. But here, as we dropped deeper into the bowl of the valley, the ambient noise simply died. The only sound was the heavy rhythmic patter of the monsoon rain hitting the broad leaves above us, and the sucking sound of our boots in the mud. There were no insects. There were no birds. It was as if a massive, invisible dome had been placed over the gorge, sealing it off from the natural world. Doc caught my eye and tapped his ear, shaking his head. He felt it too. The silence wasn't just unusual. It was oppressive. It felt heavy. It felt like the jungle was holding its breath, waiting for us. We navigated through a dense thicket of bamboo and emerged near a small, relatively flat clearing at the base of the gorge. Dominating the center of the clearing was a massive ancient banyan tree, its thick, twisted roots sprawling out like the tentacles of a giant wooden octopus. I checked my map, shielding it from the rain with my poncho, and verified the coordinates with my compass. This was the exact grid square. This was the X on Captain Caldwell's map. I signaled the team to halt and form a defensive perimeter in the brush, at the edge of the clearing. We went to ground, blending into the mud and the roots, our rifles trained on the open space. We waited for 20 minutes. We watched the tree line. We looked for the unnatural straight lines of a bunker slit, the metallic glint of a discarded ration tin, the crushed foliage of a boot print. There was nothing. The clearing was completely undisturbed. The mud around the banyan tree was smooth, pockmarked only by the falling rain. There was no brass. There were no wrappers. There were no bodies. There was no sign that any human being had walked through this coordinate in 100 years. If Vagabond had been here, if the NVA had been here to transmit that message, they had left zero physical trace. I let out a slow breath, the tension in my shoulders easing just a fraction. It was a ghost signal. Sparks had been right. A radio bounce from miles away, reflecting off the rock walls of the valley, making the TOC think it originated from this grid. We were chasing an echo. I turned slightly to look back at Sparks, preparing to give the hand signal to move out and begin a standard expanding search pattern. Sparks was kneeling in the mud, his face pale, his eyes wide behind his rain-streaked glasses. He wasn't looking at me. He was staring at the handset of his PRC-77, holding it a few inches from his ear. He didn't speak. He just slowly raised his hand and waved me over. I low-crawled through the mud, keeping my head beneath the level of the ferns, until I was shoulder to shoulder with him. The smell of wet canvas and the ozone hum of the radio was strong. Sparks didn't say a word. He just handed me the heavy plastic handset. I pressed it to my ear. There was no static. There was no hiss of atmospheric interference. The channel was crystal clear, cleaner than a telephone line back in the States. TOC. This is Vagabond. Be advised, we are currently halted at phase line blue, taking a rest near a large banyan tree. Perimeter is set. No movement in the sector. Over. The voice was Bones. It was calm, steady, speaking in the present tense. I lowered the handset, my thumb hovering over the push-to-talk button. I looked out at the clearing. I looked at the massive, twisted roots of the banyan tree, no more than 30 feet away from where I was lying in the mud. The clearing was entirely empty. There was no one there. But the voice on the radio, breathing softly into the mic between words, sounded like the man was sitting right next to me. I held the heavy plastic handset of the PRC-77 against my ear. the cold rim of the earpiece pressed tight to my skin, and listened to a dead man breathe. There was no static. There was no atmospheric hiss, no popping from the distant lightning storms that usually cluttered the radio nets during the monsoon season. There was only the rhythmic, steady sound of a man inhaling and exhaling, followed by the calm, measured voice of Bones, reporting that he was sitting in the exact same empty, mud-slicked clearing that I was currently staring at. I didn't press the push-to-talk button. I didn't say a word. I just slowly lowered the handset and handed it back to Sparks. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a hard, fast rhythm that felt entirely out of place in the suffocating silence of that jungle. My brain, trained by years of infantry tactics and survival schools, immediately went to war with what my senses were telling me. You don't believe in ghosts when you wear rank. You believe in the enemy. You believe in camouflage, in deception, in ambushes, and in the sheer brutal cunning of the North Vietnamese army. I looked at Sparks. His face was the color of old parchment behind his rain-streaked glasses. I didn't need to speak. I just gave him a sharp, flat look, then raised my right hand, clenching my fist, and pumped it downward twice. Take cover. 360-degree perimeter. Now. The rest of the team didn't hesitate. You survive in the LRRPs by moving like a single organism. Rook, our point man, melted into a thick cluster of elephant grass to our 12 o'clock. Sully and Deacon, our rear guard and machine gunner, instantly faded into the massive, sprawling roots of the banyan tree, their rifles sweeping the dark tree line. Doc slid into the mud beside me, pulling his M16 tight into his shoulder, his eyes scanning the dense foliage above us. We went to ground, burying ourselves in the red mud and rotting leaves, turning ourselves into nothing more than bumps on the jungle floor. I flicked the selector switch on my rifle from safe to semi-automatic. The tiny metallic click sounded like a gunshot in the unnatural quiet of the valley. I waited for the ambush to trigger. If the NVA had captured Bones's radio, if they were sitting in a spider hole or a camouflaged blind 50 yards away, watching us walk into this clearing, this was the moment they would initiate. They had us in the open. They had us confused. The standard doctrine for a baited ambush was to wait until the rescue element was fully exposed in the kill zone, then initiate with command-detonated claymores or a heavy machine gun crossfire. I pressed my cheek into the wet earth, the smell of decaying vegetation filling my nose, and watched the tree line over the iron sights of my rifle. The rain continued to fall in heavy, relentless sheets, beating against the broad leaves of the canopy, sending rivulets of muddy water down the back of my neck. A fat, black leech dropped from a fern and landed on the back of my hand. I didn't move to brush it off. I didn't blink. I just waited for the muzzle flashes. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. Then 20. The human body is not designed to hold that level of adrenaline for extended periods. The initial spike of pure, crystalline focus slowly begins to degrade, replaced by a creeping, exhausting dread. My muscles began to cramp from the cold mud and the tension. The jungle remained absolutely terrifyingly still. No birds. No insects. Just the rain. If they were out there, they were the most disciplined unit I had ever encountered. But it didn't make sense. You don't bait a trap and then refuse to spring it when the prey walks right into the center of the snare. I low-crawled backward, sliding through the slime and roots until I was wedged between Doc and Sparks, behind the massive, wooden trunk of the banyan tree. "Nothing," Doc whispered, his voice barely audible over the rain. He kept his eyes fixed on his sector of fire. "Not a goddamn twig snap. If Charlie is out there, they're ghosts." "They aren't ghosts," I hissed back, the frustration bleeding into my voice. "It's a trick. It has to be a trick. Sparks, talk to me. Tell me how the NVA are doing this." Sparks was huddled over his radio, shielding the faceplate from the rain with his poncho. He looked up, his eyes darting nervously around the clearing. "Sergeant, I don't know what to tell you. The signal is coming in on our primary crypto frequency. The squelch is broken completely clean. That means whoever is transmitting is either running a massive vehicle-mounted amplifier, which is impossible in this terrain, or they are practically sitting in my lap. The signal strength is pegged. They have to be within 100 meters of us." "But the voice," I said, leaning in closer. "You heard it. It was Bones. It wasn't a guy with an accent reading a script. It was Bones." "It's a tape loop," Doc interjected, his tone flat, aggressively rational. He needed it to be a tape loop. We all did. The NVA wiped out one X-ray. They took the radio. They took the codebooks. And they found a tape recorder in Bones's ruck. Maybe he was recording letters home. They spliced it together, and they're playing it over the handset to draw us in." I shook my head, the mud caking against my jaw. "No. Think about it, Doc. You heard the transmission. He wasn't talking about back home. He was giving a tactical situation report. He said he was sitting by a banyan tree. He said he was at phase line blue. He was speaking in the present tense about this exact location. They forced him to record it." Doc countered, his grip tightening on his rifle. "They captured him alive. They tortured him, brought him to this clearing, held a gun to his head, and made him read a script into a tape recorder. Then they killed him, set up the ambush, and hit play when we got close." End quote. It was a grim, horrifying thought, but it was grounded in reality. The enemy utilized psychological operations. They knew the value of a captured American radio. "Except," Sparks whispered, his voice shaking slightly. "Tape degrades, Doc. Especially out here. The humidity rots the magnetic film in a matter of days. If they recorded that 5 days ago, it would sound like it was being played underwater. There would be tape hiss. There would be popping. The audio we just heard was studio quality. There was zero mechanical distortion." "And he didn't double-click," I added, looking at both of them. Doc frowned. "What?" "Bones," I explained, keeping my voice low. "I went through selection with him. I've run a dozen field exercises with him. The guy had a nervous tick on the radio. He always double-tapped the push-to-talk button before he spoke. It was a subconscious habit. 2 clicks, then the transmission. Every single time. The voice we just heard was perfectly smooth. It sounded exactly like Bones, but it didn't act like him. It was too perfect." Doc stared at me for a long moment, the rain dripping from the brim of my boonie hat. He didn't have a medical explanation for that. He didn't have a rationalization. He just looked away, staring back out into the empty jungle. "We can't stay here," I said, making the decision. "If we stay pinned down in this clearing waiting for an ambush that isn't coming, we're sitting ducks for a mortar strike. We have to hunt the signal. Sparks, I need you to direction find. Can you track the exact point of origin?" Sparks nodded slowly. "I can try, Sergeant, but it's going to be rough. The PRC-77 has an omnidirectional antenna. It pulls signal from everywhere. To find the source, I have to use my own body as a shield." He reached behind his back and unscrewed the long, flexible whip antenna from the radio, replacing it with the shorter, stiff-blade antenna. It reduced his range, but it gave him slightly more directional control. "I have to stand up," Sparks whispered. "I have to turn in a circle. When my body blocks the signal, the audio will drop out. That means the source is directly behind me. It was a crude, dangerous method of triangulation, especially when we still believed there might be snipers in the trees, but we had no other choice. I signaled the rest of the squad. Rook, Sully, and Deacon tightened their sectors, their weapons raised and ready. "Do it," I told Sparks. "Fast." Sparks rose to a crouch, then slowly stood up, exposing himself in the center of the roots. He keyed the handset, turning the squelch dial all the way down, so the radio emitted a constant low rush of static. He began to rotate, very slowly, his eyes squeezed shut in concentration. He turned 90 degrees. The static remained constant. 180 degrees. Still constant. As he turned to face the steep rising wall of the valley to our east, a dense dark incline choked with thorns and rotting deadfall, the static on the radio suddenly choked, sputtering into silence before returning to a hiss. Sparks dropped back down into the mud, breathing hard. He pointed a trembling finger toward the dark incline. "There," he whispered. "The null was strongest when my back was to that ridge. The signal is coming from up there. Somewhere in the rocks." I checked my compass, taking a quick azimuth of the direction he pointed. It led away from the relatively flat valley floor and up into a jagged, treacherous-looking ravine that seemed to cut deep into the side of the mountain. It was exactly the kind of terrain you would use if you wanted to hide a base camp, or if you wanted to funnel a rescue team into a narrow, inescapable choke point. "All right," I said, my voice hard. "We move. Rook takes point. We go up the ravine. We stagger our spacing. If we take fire, we push forward and assault through. We don't get pinned on the incline." We formed back up into a staggered file, leaving the empty clearing and the banyan tree behind us. The jungle seemed to swallow us whole the moment we stepped into the brush at the base of the ravine. The incline was brutal. The mud was the consistency of wet concrete, offering zero traction. We were pulling ourselves up by grabbing handfuls of thorny vines and exposed roots, the heavy rucksacks threatening to pull us backward down the slope with every step. The canopy overhead was so thick here that it was almost pitch black, the rain filtering down in heavy, cold drops that felt like ice against the back of my neck. We climbed for over an hour, covering barely a few hundred yards. The silence of the jungle persisted, pressing against my eardrums, broken only by our own ragged breathing and the scraping of our gear against the rocks. Then, Rook raised his fist and dropped to a knee. The entire patrol froze, sinking into the mud, weapons leveling outward. I waited for the crack of an AK-47, but none came. Rook didn't give the hand signal for enemy sighted. Instead, he pointed down at the ground near his boots, then looked back at me, his eyes wide. I signaled for Doc and Sparks to hold the rear security, and I low-crawled up the steep, slippery embankment until I reached Rook's position. He was kneeling next to a thick cluster of bamboo. Half buried in the red mud, tangled in a mess of rotting vines, was a canvas rucksack. It was standard issue, olive drab, heavily stained with dirt and water. I reached out and grabbed the heavy nylon drag handle, pulling it free from the suction of the mud. It was incredibly heavy, completely waterlogged. I wiped the mud away from the top flap, looking for the stenciled name tape. The black ink was faded, but still legible in the gloom. Miller, WMed 1 X-ray. It was Vagabond's medic. We had found their trail. "Check for booby traps," I whispered to Rook, though my hands were already moving over the canvas, feeling for the telltale wire of a trip flare or a grenade pin rigged to the buckles. It was clean. I pulled my K-bar knife from my webbing and carefully sliced the main straps, opening the flap. What I saw inside made my stomach turn over. It wasn't the contents that were disturbing, it was the condition of the bag itself. The rucksack hadn't just been dropped or discarded in a panic. It had been destroyed. The heavy canvas was slashed to ribbons. There were dozens of deep, jagged cuts running through the fabric, slicing straight through the nylon and into the plastic medical supply bags inside. It didn't look like shrapnel damage, shrapnel tears and burns. These were clean, deep slices, like someone had taken a machete or a heavy blade and hacked at the bag in a blind, frenzied rage. I pulled out a roll of field dressings. They had been sliced in half. The white cotton was stained a deep, rusty brown. It was blood, but it was old. It had been washed out by the rain, leaving only dark, oxidized stains that smelled heavily of rot and decay. Doc crawled up beside me, his eyes locking onto the ruined medical supplies. He didn't say anything, but I saw the professional detachment in his eyes fracture for a second. He reached out, touching the blackened edge of a slashed bandage. "This is old, Huck," Doc whispered, his voice tight. "The blood is fully coagulated and breaking down. The canvas edges where the cuts are, they're fraying and rotting. This didn't happen today. This didn't happen yesterday." I looked at him, the reality of what he was saying settling over me like a physical weight. "How old?" 4, maybe 5 days, Doc said, swallowing hard. "This bag has been sitting in the mud since the day they vanished. Whoever did this to the ruck, they did it a long time ago. And there's a lot of blood here, Huck. If Miller was wearing this when it got slashed, he didn't survive it." I looked back down at the ruined bag. Doc was right. The sheer volume of blood soaked into the lower half of the canvas meant a catastrophic arterial bleed. The puzzle pieces in my head were grinding against each other, refusing to fit. If Vagabond had been ambushed here 5 days ago, if they had been hit so hard that their medic's gear was hacked to pieces and left to rot in the mud, then who the hell was on the radio? The NVA wouldn't leave a perfectly good rucksack and valuable American medical supplies in the dirt. They scavenged everything. They would have stripped the bag, taken the bandages, the morphine, the tools. Leaving it here, slashed and destroyed, wasn't a tactical decision. It was an act of raw, mindless violence. And if the team was dead, if they had been dead for 5 days, the theory of a captured radio and a coerced prisoner reading a script fell completely apart. You can't put a gun to a dead man's head and make him talk. Before I could voice any of this, before I could even process the horrifying implications of the rotting rucksack, Sparks's radio cracked the silence. The sudden hiss of the squelch breaking made us all jump. Sparks was 10 feet below us on the incline, pinned against a rock. He looked up at me, his eyes wide, and held the handset out. I slid down the muddy bank, nearly losing my footing, and grabbed the mic. "TOC, this is Vagabond. Be advised, we are altering our route. Moving up the ravine. Visibility is poor. The rain is heavy. We are pushing toward the cave system at the top of the ridge. Over." It was Bones. Calm. Steady. Unafraid. And he was describing exactly what we were doing. He was describing the ravine. He was describing the rain. He was describing the objective at the top of the ridge. He wasn't broadcasting a recorded loop from 5 days ago. He was watching us right now. I looked around the dark, oppressive jungle. The shadows between the trees seemed to stretch and contort in the gloom. There was nowhere to hide here. There was no bunker, no spider hole that could conceal a man watching us from 10 feet away. But the voice on the radio was narrating our exact movements in real time. My training demanded a rational explanation. My training demanded that I treat this as an enemy action. But the cold, primal fear building in my chest was screaming that the rules of engagement no longer applied. I looked at Sparks. His hands were shaking. He knew it too. The physics of the radio, the condition of the rucksack, the perfection of the voice, none of it made sense. "Sparks," I said, my voice dropping to a low, hard whisper. "Break protocol." Sparks blinked, rain washing over his glasses. "Sergeant?" "Do it," I ordered. "Key the handset. Don't call the TOC. Call Vagabond directly. Challenge them. Force them to prove they are looking at us." Sparks hesitated for only a fraction of a second. The military drills a strict adherence to communications protocol into you from day one. You don't break the net. You don't talk unit to unit without authorization. But Sparks was as terrified as I was, and he needed an answer just as badly. He brought the heavy plastic handset to his mouth and pressed the button. The double click of the switch echoed loudly in the silent ravine. "Vagabond, this is 2 Alpha, Sparks said, his voice surprisingly steady, the professionalism masking his fear. "We are on your net. We are in your sector. Authenticate and provide a micro-terrain description of your immediate surroundings. We are attempting to link up. Acknowledge. Over." He released the button. The squelch hissed. And then, nothing. The silence that followed was the heaviest, most suffocating thing I have ever experienced. It wasn't just the absence of sound, it was a physical pressure, like the air in the ravine was being slowly sucked away. I could hear my own pulse thudding in my ears. I could hear the rain hitting the mud. I looked at Doc. He was staring at the radio, his knuckles white around the grip of his M16. Rook and the rest of the guys were frozen, eyes wide, waiting. 10 seconds passed. 20. 30. It was the exact same agonizing wait we had experienced in the TOC, when the TOC had challenged them. I started to let out a breath, a tiny, desperate part of my brain hoping that maybe Sparks's transmission had broken the spell. That maybe whoever or whatever was playing this game had realized they were caught and shut the radio down. Then, the static broke. The channel opened. It was so clear, so incredibly clean, that I could hear the faint, wet sound of lips parting before the voice spoke. 2 Alpha, this is Vagabond, Bones said. His voice was no longer flat and routine. There was a strange, hollow resonance to it, a slight echo that didn't sound like it was bouncing off canyon walls, but rather bouncing around inside an empty room. He didn't authenticate. He didn't use the codebook. "We see you 2 Alpha, Bones said. My blood ran completely cold. "We see the medic's bag in the mud," the voice continued, perfectly describing what was happening 10 feet away from me. "We see the bamboo cluster to your left. We see the way the red mud is washing over the toe of your point man's left boot." I snapped my head to look at Rook. He was staring down in absolute horror. A small rivulet of red mud was currently sliding over the black leather of his left boot. It was impossible. It was physically, geographically impossible for anyone to have a line of sight on that specific detail without standing right next to us. I grabbed the handset from Sparks, tearing it out of his grip. I didn't care about radio discipline anymore. I didn't care about the NVA. I pressed the button, my thumb digging into the plastic. "Bones," I snarled into the mic, my voice shaking with a mixture of terror and rage. "Where the hell are you? Show yourself." I released the button. The response was instantaneous. There was no delay, no hesitation. "Keep your heads down, Huck," Bones said casually, his voice right in my ear. "They're right behind you." Before I could even turn my head, before I could even shout a warning to the team, the radio exploded. It wasn't static. It wasn't a malfunction. The small speaker on the PRC-77 erupted with the deafening, chaotic roar of a massive, close-quarters firefight. It was the unmistakable, terrifying sound of a patrol being overrun. I heard the heavy, rhythmic thud of an M60 machine gun firing cyclic. I heard the sharp, cracking pop of M16s on full auto. I heard the distinctive, metallic clatter of AK-47 fire tearing through brush. I heard the concussive thump of grenades detonating, the explosions so loud they clipped the audio on the radio's microphone. And beneath the gunfire, I heard the screaming. I heard the men of Team 1 X-Ray dying. I heard them calling out targets, their voices breaking with panic. I heard someone screaming for a medic. I heard the wet, tearing sound of rounds impacting flesh. The audio was incredibly loud, incredibly clear, blasting out of the radio handset and echoing off the walls of the ravine. I dropped the mic, slapping my hands over my ears, diving face first into the mud, screaming for the team to return fire. Rook, Doc, Sully, Deacon, they all hit the deck, their rifles sweeping the tree line, their faces contorted in absolute panic, searching for the muzzle flashes, searching for the enemy that was slaughtering us. But there was nothing to shoot at. I lay there in the mud, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it was going to crack my ribs, and stared out into the jungle. The firefight was deafening. The screaming was horrific. The explosions sounded like they were happening right on top of us, but it was only coming from the radio. The actual jungle around us, the trees, the bamboo, the dark ravine, remained completely, terrifyingly silent. Not a single leaf moved. Not a single bullet cracked overhead. We were lying in the mud, surrounded by the ghosts of a dead patrol, listening to them die all over again. The audio cut off as abruptly as it had begun. 1 second. The small green speaker of the PRC-77 was vibrating with the chaotic, deafening roar of a massacre, the cyclic thud of the M60, the cracking of rifles, the horrific, desperate screams of men being torn apart in the dark. The next second, there was nothing but the soft, rhythmic hiss of the squelch. The silence that rushed back into the ravine was heavier than before. It felt like a physical weight pressing down on the back of my neck. My ears were ringing, a high-pitched whine echoing in my skull from the sheer volume of the radio burst. I lay in the mud, my rifle pressed into my shoulder, my finger resting just outside the trigger guard, and stared into the dark, dripping bamboo thicket. I didn't breathe. I waited for the real bullets to follow the phantom ones. I waited for the tree line to erupt in muzzle flashes. I waited for the NVA to step out of the shadows and finish what they had just made us listen to. Nothing moved. The monsoon rain continued to fall, pattering against the broad leaves of the elephant grass, washing the red mud over my knuckles. The jungle remained entirely, impossibly still. I slowly turned my head. To my left, Doc was pressed flat against the earth, his eyes wide and unblinking, his chest heaving as he stared into the brush. Behind me, Rook and Sully were locked in place, their weapons tracking invisible targets. Sparks was curled into a tight ball around his radio, his face buried in his arms, his shoulders trembling. We had just endured a full-scale ambush, but not a single round had been fired. The enemy had bypassed our armor, bypassed our perimeter, and dropped a psychological artillery shell directly into our brains. "Report," I croaked, my voice sounding harsh and foreign in the quiet. "Sound off. Sectors. Front clear," Rook whispered, his voice shaking. Left flank clear, Doc said, swallowing hard. Rear clear, Sully echoed from the base of the tree. I pushed myself up onto my elbows, the mud sucking at my uniform. Sparks, you good? Sparks slowly lifted his head. He looked at the radio handset lying in the mud as if it were a live grenade. He nodded slowly, reaching out with a trembling hand to pick it up, wiping the wet clay from the speaker grill. I sat up, resting my rifle across my knees, and wiped the rain from my eyes. My mind was racing, tearing through tactical manuals, field experience, and enemy threat briefings, desperately searching for a drawer to file this under. The North Vietnamese army were masters of psychological warfare. I knew that. Every man in the LRRPs knew that. We had all been briefed on Operation Wandering Soul. The NVA, and occasionally our own PSYOPs guys, would use heavy tape recorders and massive helicopter-mounted loudspeakers to blast audio into the jungle at night. They played recordings of Buddhist funeral music, crying women, or the distorted wailing voices of supposedly dead soldiers calling out to their comrades from the afterlife. The goal was to terrify the ARVN troops, to break their morale and make them abandon their posts. "It's a tape," Doc whispered, crawling closer to me. His eyes were frantic, searching my face for agreement. He needed this to be rational. His entire worldview, his medical training, demanded cause and effect. "Huck, it's a goddamn tape. They recorded the ambush. They wiped out Vagabond 5 days ago. They recorded the firefight, and now they're playing it over the net to break us." I looked at him, the cold rain washing the sweat from my face. "Doc, you heard what Bones said right before the audio hit." He said, "Keep your heads down, Huck. They're right behind you." They forced him to say it, Doc argued, his voice rising in panic. They had him captured. They put a script in front of him. They made him read it into a microphone. "Doc, listen to me," Sparks interrupted, his voice surprisingly steady now that he was back in the realm of radio theory. He adjusted his glasses, squinting through the rain. "That wasn't a tape loop. You can't splice a tape in the middle of a monsoon and have it sound like that. And more importantly, a tape recorder can't see the mud on Rook's boot. A tape recorder doesn't know we found the medic's bag. They have spotters," Doc hissed, pointing into the trees. "They're out there right now, watching us, radioing back to whoever is running the transmitter." "And what about the nickname?" I asked quietly. Doc stopped, his jaw tightening. "My name is Sergeant Huckleberry," I said, keeping my voice low, forcing the calm into the center of the patrol. "On the net, my call sign is 2 Alpha. The TOC calls me 2 Alpha. The relay stations call me 2 Alpha. If the NVA captured Bones's codebooks, they have our call signs. They don't have our nicknames. Huck isn't written down in any signal operating instructions manual. The only way the enemy knows that name is if they interrogated Bones. And he broke." "So he broke," Doc said defensively. "Every man has a breaking point, Huck." "Bones wouldn't break on day one," I countered, pointing back down the ravine toward the slashed rucksack we had found. "And look at the timeline, Doc. You said yourself that Ruck has been rotting in the mud for 5 days. You said the blood was fully coagulated. If they ambushed Vagabond here, on the day they dropped, and slaughtered them, when did they have time to calmly interrogate Bones, get my nickname, set up a flawless radio mimic, and narrate our exact movements in real time?" Doc opened his mouth to argue, then closed. He looked down at the mud, his hands gripping his rifle so tightly his knuckles were stark white. He didn't have an answer. Neither did I. But I had a memory. Sitting in the TOC briefing room a week ago, looking over the topographical maps of this sector, The maps were overlays, modern contour lines printed over old French colonial surveys from the First Indochina War. I remembered the faded French text marking this specific valley. Zone of navigational anomalies. At the time, I had assumed it meant magnetic iron deposits in the rock that messed with compass needles. But the French had been fighting in these highlands long before we got here. They had sent their Foreign Legion patrols deep into these exact same triple canopy gorges. There were stories, rumors passed around by the old-timer MACV SOG guys who drank at the club in Saigon, about the French after-action reports from 1953. They called areas like this the Valleys of Parrots. The Legionnaires had reported that the jungle itself seemed to learn their voices. A patrol would be moving through the fog, and a man at the rear would hear his squad leader calling his name from the deep brush, pulling him off the trail. They would find the men days later, dead, with no signs of enemy contact. The official military explanation had always been enemy deception. Wiretapping, ventriloquism, psyops. But kneeling in the mud, listening to the impossible clarity of a dead man's voice on my radio, those old ghost stories suddenly felt terrifyingly like intelligence reports. "Sparks," I said, shaking the thoughts from my head. I had a team to lead. I couldn't afford to get lost in the weeds of the impossible. "Can you get a signal out of this bowl? I need to talk to Caldwell. I need to get us authorized to pull back." Sparks looked at the steep walls of the ravine rising on either side of us. "I can try to bounce a tight beam off the ionosphere, or hit the relay station on Hill 881 if the clouds break. But I need to rig a jungle antenna. The whip won't cut it." "Do it," I ordered. "Rook, Sully. Push out 10 meters. Set trip flares. If anything moves in that brush, you light it up. We hold here until we get TOC on the horn." For the next 20 minutes, we sat in the agonizing silence of the ravine while Sparks worked. He pulled a spool of thin copper wire from his ruck, tied a rock to one end, and expertly heaved it over a high branch of a nearby mahogany tree. He hoisted the wire up, creating an improvised elevated antenna, and wired it directly into the antenna port of the PRC-77. He keyed the handset, cycling through frequencies, fighting the atmospheric interference and the sheer density of the rock walls around us. Finally, he got a burst of static that sounded different. The distinct, encrypted squelch of the Firebase relay. He handed me the mic. "6, this is 2 Alpha. Over," I said, keeping my voice clipped and professional. The radio hissed, popped, and then Captain Caldwell's voice came through, buried under a layer of static. "2 Alpha, this is 6. Go ahead. Have you made visual contact with Vagabond? Over." "Negative visual, 6, I replied. "Be advised, Vagabond is compromised. I say again, Vagabond is a negative. We have located discarded gear belonging to their medic. Heavy blood loss indicated. Gear has been exposed to the elements for multiple days. Over." There was a long pause on the other end. I could hear the faint background noise of the TOC, the hum of the generators, the muffled voices of the radio men. When Caldwell spoke again, his voice was tight, strained by the exhaustion of a man who refused to lose another team on his watch. "2 Alpha, clarify. Are you confirming KIA? Over." "Unable to confirm KIA, 6, I said carefully. But based on the physical evidence, the team took catastrophic casualties at the time of insertion. Furthermore, 6, we are taking psychological harassment on the net. We are receiving transmissions claiming to be Vagabond, but they are hostile decoys. The enemy is using their call sign to bait this element. Request permission to abort search pattern and extract. Over. I waited for the authorization. I waited for Caldwell to look at the map, realize we were sitting in a kill zone, and pull us out. Negative, 2 Alpha. Caldwell's voice cracked through the static, hard and uncompromising. We are still tracking Vagabond's signal. Our direction finding confirms they are broadcasting from a cave system at the top of the ridge. Grid coordinate 0904, 972. I am listening to Bones right now on the secondary net. He is requesting immediate link-up. He says he is wounded. Over. I stared at the radio. My stomach twisted into a cold, hard knot. 6, that is a negative, I insisted, my voice rising. Whoever is on that radio is not Bones. We just took a massive audio transmission simulating a firefight. They are narrating our movements. It is an ambush. Over. Sergeant Huckleberry, Caldwell snapped, dropping the call signs. The use of my rank and name over the net was a clear indicator that the conversation was over. I am looking at the telemetry. I am listening to a United States Army Ranger asking for help. I am not going to write off 6 men because you are getting spooked by some NVA radio tricks. You have your grid coordinate. You push to that cave system, you secure that team, and you bring them home. That is a direct order. Acknowledge. Over. I closed my eyes. The rain beat against my eyelids. The military is a machine, and the machine only understands data. Caldwell had a signal on a map, and a voice on a speaker. He didn't have the rotting rucksack. He didn't have the unnatural silence of the jungle. He didn't feel the wrongness of this valley seeping into his bones. Solid copy 6, I said, my voice dead flat. 2 Alpha is moving to the objective. Out. I handed the handset back to Sparks. He didn't say anything, but the look in his eyes told me he had heard every word. Doc was staring at me, his jaw clenched so tight I thought his teeth might crack. He's sending us up, Doc stated. It wasn't a question. He's looking at a map in a dry bunker, I said, securing my rifle. He thinks Bones is in a cave at the top of this ridge. So we go to the cave. Huck, it's suicide, Doc pleaded, grabbing my harness. If they have the high ground, if they're sitting in a cave complex looking down this ravine, they're going to slaughter us the second we break the tree line. Then we don't give them a target, I said, shrugging off his grip. We move staggered. We use the deadfall for cover. If we take fire, we bound and assault. But we are moving. I gave the hand signals. We broke down the improvised antenna, packed the gear, and began the climb. If the first part of the ravine had been brutal, the upper half was a nightmare. The incline steepened to nearly 45 degrees. The mud was a continuous sliding river of red slurry. The roots we used as handholds were slick with rot, often snapping under our weight. The canopy grew even denser, blocking out what little daylight remained, plunging us into a perpetual, suffocating twilight. Every step was a battle against gravity and the terrain. The physical exertion was immense. My lungs burned, drawing in the hyper-humid air that tasted like wet copper and decaying leaves. The leeches were everywhere now, dropping from the branches, sliding up our sleeves, finding the gaps in our boots. We didn't stop to burn them off. We just kept climbing. About halfway up the steepest section, disaster nearly struck. Rook, who was point, reached up to grab a thick moss-covered boulder to pull himself over a ledge. As he hauled his weight up, the mud beneath the boulder gave way. The massive rock shifted, groaning against the earth, and then broke loose. Rook yelled, throwing himself sideways into the brush as the boulder, easily weighing 300 pounds, tumbled backward down the ravine. It crashed through the bamboo, picking up speed, a tidal wave of red mud sliding down behind it. Sparks was directly in its path. "Sparks, move!" I screamed, lunging forward. Sparks scrambled backward, his boots slipping uselessly in the slurry. The weight of the PRC-77 on his back acted like an anchor, pulling his center of gravity down. He fell hard onto his back, sliding down the incline toward the tumbling rock. Sully, who was a few yards below him, threw himself across the mud chute, bracing his boots against a thick tree root, and grabbed Sparks by the webbing of his harness, just as the boulder tore past them, missing Sparks's helmet by inches. The rock smashed into a mahogany trunk below us with a sickening crack and settled into the mud. Sparks lay there, gasping for air, his hands clutching Sully's arm. I scrambled down to them, checking Sparks over. He was covered in mud, pale and shaking but unhurt. I checked the radio. The heavy metal casing was smeared with clay, but the dials were intact. The handset was still secured to the harness. "You good?" I asked Sparks, hauling him back up to his feet. He nodded, spitting a mouthful of gritty water. "I'm good, Sergeant. Radio is secure." Even then, terrified out of his mind, his first thought was the equipment. Because in the deep jungle, the equipment was life. We resumed the climb, moving even slower now, testing every foothold, every branch. The silence of the valley remained absolute. The only sound was the rain and the rasp of our own breathing. The absence of enemy fire was becoming more terrifying than an actual ambush. The anticipation was a physical pressure, winding tighter and tighter with every yard we gained. Finally, after another hour of agonizing vertical movement, the terrain began to level out. The dense bamboo gave way to scattered, stunted trees and massive, jagged outcroppings of dark gray basalt. We had reached the shelf near the top of the ridge. I signaled a halt, dropping to a knee behind a slab of rock. I pulled out my map and compass. According to Caldwell's coordinates, the cave system was directly ahead of us, somewhere in the rock face that formed the crown of the ridge. I crept forward, Rook flanking me on the right, our rifles raised. Through the driving rain and the shifting fog, a dark, jagged fissure appeared in the cliff wall ahead. It was wide enough for two men to walk abreast, a natural opening carved into the stone by centuries of water runoff. But before I even saw the entrance clearly, the smell hit me. It rolled out of the cave mouth on a cold draft of air, cutting through the scent of rain and wet earth. It was heavy, sweet, and suffocating. It was the smell of copper, voided bowels, and the sickly, unmistakable stench of advanced human decomposition. Doc, coming up behind me, gagged, pulling his OD green towel up over his nose and mouth. He looked at me, his eyes wide above the fabric. He didn't need to say it. We both knew what that smell meant. Nobody inside that cave was calling for a medevac. "Fix bayonets," I whispered. If we were walking into a confined space, I wanted cold steel ready. The metallic snick of the blades locking onto the lugs of the M16s was the only sound. I pulled a crookneck flashlight from my webbing, clicking it on. The beam cut a weak yellow cone through the gloom. "Rook, Sully, hold the entrance. Cover R6, I ordered. "Doc, Sparks, on me. We go in slow." We stepped out of the rain and into the mouth of the cave. The temperature dropped immediately, the air turning cold and dead. The floor was relatively flat, covered in a layer of fine, dry dust that hadn't been touched by the monsoon. I swept the flashlight beam slowly from left to right, illuminating the rough, wet walls of the cavern. The space opened up into a larger chamber about 30 feet deep. The beam of light caught something reflective on the ground, a discarded brass casing. then another, then the shredded remnants of a flak jacket. I moved the beam upward, toward the back wall of the cave. The team was there. They were slumped against the stone, arranged in a loose defensive semicircle facing the entrance. I felt the breath leave my lungs in a long, ragged exhale. Beside me, Sparks let out a small, strangled noise and looked away, bracing his hand against the cave wall. Doc stepped past me, his medical training taking over, overriding the horror. He didn't need his aid bag. It was a slaughterhouse. Team 1 X-Ray had made their last stand in this cavern. The walls behind them were pockmarked and cratered by hundreds of bullet strikes. The ground was littered with thousands of spent shell casings, empty magazines, and the blast-scorched spoons of hand grenades. But it was the bodies that told the true story of the timeline. They had not died today. They had not died yesterday. The jungle heat and the humidity, even inside the cooler cave, had accelerated the decay. The exposed skin on their hands and faces was bloated, blackened, and tight. The uniforms were stiff, with dried, oxidized blood that looked like dark rust in the flashlight beam. The smell was overpowering, a physical force that made my eyes water and my stomach heave. Doc moved from man to man, checking the dog tags laced into their boots, his face a grim mask. "Peterson," Doc whispered, shining his light on the point man. Multiple gunshot wounds to the chest. He moved to the next body. "Miller." "The medic." Doc paused, his hand hovering over the ruined chest of the man who shared his job. "He's missing his ruck. Shrapnel trauma. Massive." I walked past them, my boots crunching on the carpet of brass. I was looking for the team leader. I was looking for Bones. I found him near the center of the formation, propped up behind a small barricade of loose rocks. His rifle was empty, the bolt locked to the rear. His hands were resting in his lap. His head was slumped forward, the helmet tilted down, concealing his face. Doc came up beside me, shining his light on Bones's chest. The uniform was torn to shreds by what looked like a close-range burst of heavy machine gun fire. "5 days, Huck," Doc said, his voice flat, hollowed out by the reality of the room. "Look at the lividity. Look at the tissue breakdown. They died the day they dropped into this valley. They never even made it to their first check-in." I stared at Bones's blackened, rotting hands. If Bones had been dead for 5 days, if his vocal cords had been rotting in this cave since Tuesday, who the hell had I been talking to 30 minutes ago? I swept my flashlight around the immediate area near Bones's body. I was looking for the source. I was looking for the radio. If the NVA had taken it, they had taken it 5 days ago. The beam of light hit a shape wedged into a crack in the rock wall, just behind Bones's position. I stepped closer, leaning over the barricade. It was the PRC-77. It hadn't been captured. It hadn't been stolen by the NVA to use as a psychological weapon. It had been destroyed in the firefight. I reached out and touched the metal casing. It was cold. The entire left side of the radio had been caved in, likely by the same burst of fire that had killed Bones. The battery compartment was split open, the heavy batteries inside ruptured and leaking white, crusty acid. The dials on the faceplate were smashed, the glass over the frequency tuner shattered. The interior wiring was exposed, rusted shut by the damp air of the cave. This radio had not transmitted a single signal in 5 days. It was a dead block of metal. It was physically incapable of powering on, let alone broadcasting a crystal-clear, encrypted voice transmission. I stood there in the dark, the smell of death filling my nose, staring at the shattered radio. Every rational explanation I had built, Every tactical theory I had clung to crumbled into dust. There were no NVA spotters. There was no tape recorder. There was no captured equipment. There was only the valley. Behind me, Sparks let out a sharp gasp. I spun around, bringing my rifle up. Sparks was standing near the entrance of the cave, staring down at the handset of his own PRC-77, which was clipped to his harness. The squelch had just broken. The static hissed, loud and clear in the echoing chamber of the cave. Then, the calm, steady voice of Bones, a voice belonging to a man whose rotting corpse was sitting 3 feet away from me, spilled out of the speaker. "Do you see us, Huck?" The voice did not come from the smashed, acid-leaking block of metal wedged into the rocks behind the bodies. It came from the handset clipped to Sparks's harness, echoing loudly in the damp, confined space of the cavern. I stood paralyzed, the yellow beam of my crookneck flashlight trembling slightly as it illuminated the rotting, blackened face of the man who was supposedly speaking to me. Bones's jaw was slack, his mouth hanging open in a silent, eternal scream, his vocal cords long since dissolved by the brutal humidity and the insects of the Central Highlands. "Do you see us, Huck?" The words hung in the dead air, perfectly clear, completely devoid of static. It was the voice of my friend, speaking to me from a throat that no longer existed. My mind, conditioned by years of infantry training to find the logical, tactical solution to any problem, violently rejected what was happening. I stepped forward, my boots crunching over the carpet of spent brass, and grabbed the ruined PRC-77 from the rocks. I hauled it up, shining my light directly into the shattered casing. The wiring was rusted solid. The circuit boards were cracked in half. The heavy batteries were split, oozing a crusty white chemical paste that smelled sharp and toxic. This radio had not transmitted a signal in 5 days. It was a paperweight. "Where is it?" Doc demanded, his voice bordering on hysterical. He pushed past me, his hands frantically searching the loose rocks around Bones's body, tossing aside empty magazines and shrapnel-torn webbing. "Where's the speaker? Where's the wire?" "They have a wire rigged in here. They have a microphone planted in the rocks." Doc was a man of science. He patched bullet holes. He treated infections. He understood cause and effect. He was desperately trying to force the impossible reality of this cave into a box he could understand. He grabbed Bones's rotting flak jacket, tearing at the nylon, searching for a hidden wire, a hidden transmitter, anything that could explain how a dead man was talking on our frequency. "Doc, stop," I said, grabbing him by the shoulder and hauling him back. "Look at him. Look at the room. Nobody has been in here since they died." "It's a trick," Doc yelled, his voice cracking, echoing off the high stone ceiling. "It's a goddamn NVA trick, Huck. They're outside. They're watching us right now." I turned to look at the cave entrance. Rook and Sully were framed against the pale, sickly light of the jungle, their rifles pointed outward, their bodies rigid with terror. But there was no one out there. The jungle was empty. And worse, the weather had just slammed the door shut on us. The monsoon, which had been a steady, miserable downpour all morning, suddenly broke with the apocalyptic fury that only the highlands can produce. The sky outside turned a bruised, violent purple, and the rain didn't just fall, it collapsed. A solid sheet of water cascaded over the lip of the cave entrance, creating a thick, roaring waterfall that instantly drowned out all other noise. The temperature plummeted further. Lightning flashed, casting stark, strobing shadows across the dead men sitting against the wall, followed instantly by thunder that shook the dust from the cavern roof. We were trapped. The steep, 45-degree mud chute we had just climbed to get up here would now be a literal river of red clay and debris. Attempting to climb down in this deluge, would mean being swept off the cliff face and crushed in the rocks below. And a helicopter extraction was entirely out of the question. No pilot in the world could fly in this soup. We were sealed inside a tomb with 6 dead men, and whatever had killed them was still on the radio. Sparks was backed against the far wall of the cave, his eyes wide behind his rain-streaked glasses. He was staring at his handset as if a poisonous snake were coiled around his webbing. "Sergeant," Sparks stammered, his voice barely audible over the roaring rain outside. "The signal, it didn't bounce, it didn't relay, it came straight through. The point of origin is 0 meters. It's coming from inside the room." End quote. Before I could process the sheer impossibility of that statement, the squelch on Sparks's radio broke again. The transmission didn't start with words. It started with a sound that made the blood in my veins turn to ice water. It was a wet, ragged, desperate gasp for air. It was the sound of a man who had just been shot in the lungs, trying to pull oxygen through blood. Then, Bones spoke. But the calm conversational mimicry was gone. The eerie, present-tense narration was gone. This voice was raw, throat-tearing panic. It was the sound of a man watching his team get slaughtered in the dark, screaming into his handset as the enemy overran his position.
"TOC! TOC! This is Vagabond! We are taking heavy fire! They're inside the perimeter!"
"We are overrun!" The background audio behind his voice erupted into the same deafening crescendo of violence we had heard down in the ravine. The cyclic roar of the M60 machine gun, the cracking of AK-47s, the concussive thump of grenades, and the horrifying, desperate screams of the men lying dead at our feet. It was a recording. It had to be a recording. But it wasn't playing from a tape deck in the jungle. It was playing out of the very air around us, broadcast directly into our cryptographic frequency. "Broken Arrow!" Bones screamed, his voice distorting the microphone with the sheer volume of his panic. "I say again, Broken Arrow. Any station on this net. This is Vagabond. We are declaring a broken arrow." The phrase hit me like a physical blow to the chest. In the United States military, broken arrow is the ultimate panic button. It is a code word used only when a ground unit is facing imminent destruction, when their perimeter has collapsed, and they are about to be entirely wiped out. When a unit calls a broken arrow, every available combat aircraft, every artillery battery, and every gunship in the theater drops whatever mission they are on, and immediately routes to that location to lay down a wall of fire. It is a desperate, apocalyptic request for everything the military has to be dropped on one specific point. "Fire mission!" Bones shrieked over the radio, the sound of tearing flesh and dying men echoing behind him. "Battery 3 rounds, high explosive, point detonating. I need it now, goddammit. I need it now." "Sparks," I yelled over the noise, my heart hammering against my ribs. "The coordinates." "Listen for the coordinates. Grid 09 or 4, Bones screamed, his voice cracking in terror. 9 or 7-2, danger close. I say again, danger close, drop it right on us." Sparks didn't need to pull out his map. He didn't need to use his grease pencil. He looked up at me, his face completely drained of blood, his eyes wide with a horrific realization. "Huck," Sparks whispered, his voice trembling so hard I could barely hear him over the radio traffic. "That's us. That's this cave." The trap hadn't been an NVA ambush in the clearing. The trap hadn't been a sniper in the trees. The trap was the radio, the valley, the phenomenon, the entity, whatever the hell was out there in the dark, had recorded the horrific, final moments of Team 1 X-Ray 5 days ago. It had recorded Bones's desperate, dying plea for artillery support, on his own position to take the enemy down with him. And now, it was playing that exact recording back over the net, perfectly mimicked, perfectly timed. It wasn't going to kill us with rifles. It was going to use our own military against us. It was using the rigid, uncompromising protocols of the United States Army to wipe us off the face of the earth. 6. This is Vagabond, please. The ghost of Bones begged over the speaker, the audio so clear I could hear the spit flying from his lips. They're coming through the wire. Drop it on the grid. Drop it now, the static hissed, and then Captain Caldwell's voice punched through the interference. Vagabond, this is 6, Caldwell said. His voice was completely different from the strained, exhausted tone he had used with me. It was hard, fast, and driven by pure adrenaline. He was hearing his missing men being slaughtered. He was doing exactly what a commander is trained to do. Broken arrow received. Fire mission received. Grid 0904, 972 verified. Hold on, son. Rounds are on the way. Caldwell was authorizing the strike. He was calling the firebase artillery batteries. He was giving them our exact coordinates. No! I screamed, lunging across the dusty floor of the cave and ripping the heavy plastic handset out of Sparks's hand. I pressed the push-to-talk button, my thumb digging into the plastic so hard my knuckle popped. 6. This is 2 Alpha. Abort! Abort fire mission. I roared into the microphone, my voice echoing off the stone walls. We are at that grid. I say again, 2 Alpha is at that grid. Vagabond is KIA. The transmission is a decoy. Abort the fire mission. Acknowledge. I released the button, my chest heaving, waiting for Caldwell's voice, waiting for the confirmation that he had heard me, that he was calling off the guns. The radio hissed. And then, a voice came back over the speaker. But it wasn't Caldwell. 6. This is 2 Alpha. Abort. Abort fire mission. It was my own voice. It was the exact transmission I had just made, played back to me with perfect clarity. I stared at the handset in absolute horror. I keyed the mic again. TOC. This is Sergeant Huckleberry. Do not fire on grid 0904, 972. We are in the cave. You are going to kill us. I released the button. TOC. This is Sergeant Huckleberry. Do not fire on grid 0904. My voice looped back instantly. But this time, it didn't just play once. It began to overlap. 6. This is 2 Alpha. Abort. TOC. This is Sergeant Huckleberry. Abort fire mission. You are going to kill us. The audio multiplied. It sounded like 10 versions of me, all screaming into the radio at the same time. A chaotic, maddening chorus of my own terror, echoing out of the small green speaker. The valley was jamming us. It wasn't just blocking our signal. It was recording our panic in real time and throwing it back in our faces, clogging the frequency with a wall of noise so dense that nothing could get through to the TOC. Sparks, change the frequency, I yelled, tossing the handset to him. Get on the secondary net. Get on the medevac channel. Get on the guard frequency. Anything. Sparks's hands were flying over the dials, his fingers frantically twisting the heavy black knobs. He switched to the secondary battalion net. He keyed the mic. Abort fire mission. You are going to kill us. The chorus of my voice was there too. He switched to the emergency guard frequency, the universal channel monitored by every aircraft in the country. 6. This is 2 Alpha. Abort. Abort. It was everywhere. The anomaly had blanketed the entire electromagnetic spectrum. Every frequency, every channel, every encrypted net was choked with the sound of my own voice begging for my life, looping endlessly, a terrifying, claustrophobic wall of sound that sealed us off from the rest of the world, just as effectively as the stone walls of the cave. "They can't hear us," Sparks whispered, dropping his hands from the radio, his eyes hollow. "The TOC can't hear us. The guns can't hear us. We're jammed out." I looked out the mouth of the cave. The monsoon rain was a solid, impenetrable gray curtain. We couldn't run. If we stepped out onto that 45-degree mudslide, we would be swept away. And even if we managed to keep our footing, we would be completely exposed on the open face of the ridge. A 105mm artillery shell doesn't need to hit you directly to kill you. The blast radius of high explosive is massive. The shrapnel, jagged, razor-sharp pieces of cast iron traveling at supersonic speeds, will cut a man in half from 50 yards away. If we were caught on the side of that ravine when the shells hit, we would be shredded. Our only cover was the cave. But the cave was the target. If a 105mm shell impacted the cliff face directly above us, the concussion would shatter the stone. The roof of the cavern would collapse, burying us alive beneath hundreds of tons of basalt, sealing us in this tomb alongside the rotting corpses of Team 1 X-Ray. We were completely, utterly trapped. "Take cover!" I screamed at the top of my lungs, grabbing Doc by the webbing and throwing him toward the deepest, darkest corner of the cave. "Rook! Sully! Deacon! Get away from the entrance! Get against the back wall! Get down and open your mouths." You open your mouth during an artillery barrage so the pressure wave doesn't blow your eardrums out from the inside. It's a small, pathetic defense against a weapon designed to level cities. But it was all we had. The team scrambled backward in the dark, tripping over the spent brass and the rotting legs of the dead men. We threw ourselves into the furthest corner of the cavern, wedging ourselves into the narrowest fissures in the rock, pulling our rucksacks over our heads to protect against falling stone. The radio on Sparks's back was still broadcasting the maddening, looping chorus of my own voice, mixing with the horrific audio of Bones screaming for the fire mission. It was a symphony of ghosts, orchestrating our execution. I buried my face in the crook of my arm, pressing my helmet hard against the rock wall. I could smell the dust, the rust, and the sickeningly sweet odor of the dead medic, lying 3 feet away from me. We waited for the sky to fall. The silence outside the cave, beneath the roar of the waterfall, felt heavy and pregnant. Time seemed to stretch, every second agonizingly slow. In my mind, I could see the artillerymen at the fire base, miles away in the rain. I could see them stripping the green cardboard tubes off the heavy brass shells. I could see them ramming the rounds into the breeches of the howitzers. I could see the gunners pulling the lanyards, believing with absolute certainty that they were saving American lives. And then, I heard it. It started as a low, distant vibration, a subaudible hum that I felt in the marrow of my bones before I actually heard it with my ears. Then, the sound breached the heavy canopy of the jungle. It is a sound that no infantryman ever forgets. It does not sound like a whistle. It does not sound like a siren. It sounds like the fabric of the sky is being violently torn in half by a massive, invisible hand. It is a deep, rushing, freight train roar that sucks the air out of your lungs as it passes overhead. The first shell was coming in. It was a ranging round. The artillery battery fires one shell first, checking the coordinates, waiting for the forward observer to adjust the fire before they unleash the full battery for effect. But we were the target, and the ghost on the radio was the observer. The tearing sound grew deafening, drowning out the monsoon, drowning out the radio, vibrating through the solid stone of the ridge. I squeezed my eyes shut, my jaw locked open, waiting for the impact. The 105mm high-explosive shell slammed into the ridgeline, less than 50 yards above the roof of the cave. The explosion was catastrophic. It wasn't just a sound, it was a physical entity that punched into the cavern. The shockwave hit us like a solid wall of compressed air, throwing me hard against the stone face. The ground bucked violently beneath me, tossing the rotting corpses of one X-ray into the air like discarded ragdolls. A blinding flash of orange light illuminated the mouth of the cave, followed instantly by a deafening concussive crack that shattered the remaining glass on Sparks's radio dials. The roof of the cave groaned, a deep structural scream of stressed rock. A massive shower of dust, gravel, and jagged splinters of basalt rained down on us, pinging sharply off our Kevlar helmets and tearing through the nylon of our rucksacks. The blast wave rolled back out of the cave, leaving my ears ringing with a high-pitched, agonizing whine that entirely wiped out my hearing. I lay in the dust, coughing violently, the air thick with the smell of pulverized stone and the sharp chemical stench of cordite. I couldn't hear the rain. I couldn't hear my men. But as the ringing in my ears slowly began to recede, a new sound cut through the dust. It was the radio. The chorus of my own voice had stopped. The chaotic audio of the firefight was gone. Instead, the crystal-clear voice of Bones came over the speaker, calm, measured, and perfectly mimicking standard artillery adjustment protocol. 6. This is Vagabond. Good impact. Target bracketed. Drop 50. Fire for effect. He was walking the artillery barrage directly into the mouth of the cave. The sheer, cold-blooded tactical perfection of it froze the blood in my veins. The voice of my dead friend, broadcasting from a radio that was currently hanging off the harness of a terrified 19-year-old kid, was acting as a forward observer for our own execution. The entity in the valley, the geographic mimic, the anomaly, whatever the hell you wanted to call the invisible predator that owned this gorge, had learned the rules of our war. It had absorbed the frantic, dying screams of Team 1 X-Ray 5 days ago. It had memorized the rigid, unyielding protocols of the United States Army Artillery Corps. And now it was weaponizing our own doctrine against us. Drop 50. The voice of Bones repeated, perfectly calm, entirely devoid of the panic that had laced the earlier transmission. Target is a cave system. Hard rock cover. Recommend delay fuses for penetration. Over. Delay fuses. The thing on the radio was asking the firebase to switch from point detonating rounds which explode on contact with the ground to delay fuses, which burrow into rock or concrete for a fraction of a second before detonating. It was specifically asking for the exact type of ordnance required to collapse a cave roof and bury everyone inside. Solid copy, Vagabond. Captain Caldwell's voice crackled back, distorted by the wall of overlapping static that the valley was still pumping out to jam my own desperate calls. Adjusting fire. Stand by. We had seconds. A 105mm howitzer battery takes less than a minute to adjust their elevation dials, shift the gun tubes, and load the next round. Once they fired that second ranging shot, if it hit the ledge outside, they would immediately call fire for effect. That meant every gun in the battery would unleash a continuous, devastating barrage on this specific grid square until the cliff face was reduced to gravel. Sparks! I roared, coughing on the thick cordite-laced dust that was still drifting down from the cavern roof. I scrambled across the floor on my hands and knees, ignoring the spent brass digging into my palms and the rotting, rigid legs of the dead men I was crawling over. Sparks, look at me. Sparks was curled into a fetal position against the back wall, his hands clamped over his ears, his eyes squeezed shut in absolute terror. The PRC-77 on his back was still emitting that maddening, overlapping chorus of my own voice, screaming for the fire mission to be aborted, mixed with the dead, calm voice of Bones adjusting the artillery. I grabbed Sparks by the shoulder straps of his webbing and hauled him upright, slamming his back against the stone wall. His helmet knocked against the rock, his eyes snapped open, wide and unfocused behind his shattered glasses. "Sparks, you have to break the jam," I screamed, my face inches from his. The ringing in my ears was so loud I couldn't even tell if I was projecting my voice properly, but I could feel the raw vibration in my throat. "You have to get a signal to the TOC. You have to tell them to check fire." "I can't, Sergeant," Sparks screamed back, tears cutting tracks through the thick layer of gray dust on his cheeks. "The frequency is saturated. It's a broadband blanket. Every channel, every crypto net, it's all full of your voice. The anomaly is taking every radio wave we push out, duplicating it, and bouncing it back at us. There's no space on the spectrum for a transmission to get through." He was right. I knew he was right. The military relies on clear, structured communication. You wait your turn, you key the handset, you speak, you release. But the valley wasn't playing by those rules. It was suffocating the airwaves with a solid wall of noise. You can't whisper a warning to a friend across a room if a jet engine is screaming in between you. "Then we don't send a message," I said, the realization hitting me with a sudden, desperate clarity. "We don't use words. We send a spike. We send something so loud, it blows the headsets off the guys sitting in the TOC." Sparks stared at me, his chest heaving, the tactical radio operator in him, the kid who treated the PRC-77 like a sacred object, fought against the sheer insanity of what I was suggesting. But the soldier in him, the kid who was about to be crushed under 1,000 tons of basalt, caught on instantly. "An EMP," Sparks breathed, his eyes widening. "An electromagnetic pulse. A feedback squeal." "Can you do it?" I demanded, shaking him. "Can you make that box scream loud enough to punch through the jam?" Sparks looked down at the radio on his hip, then over at the ruined, acid-leaking radio wedged in the rocks behind Bones's body. His mind was racing, doing the electrical math. "The battery," Sparks said, his words coming out in a frantic rush. "The BA4386 battery. It's magnesium and manganese dioxide. If I bypass the voltage regulator, if I strip the main power leads and short them directly into a high heat source, I can force the battery into a catastrophic thermal runaway. It won't just transmit a signal, Huck. It will dump all of its stored electrical energy into the transmitter at once. It will create a massive, uncontrolled broadband spike. It'll fry our radio completely, but for a fraction of a second, it will scream across every frequency on the dial. The feedback loop in the TOC will be deafening. It'll sound like a bomb went off in their comms room. Will it stop the guns?" Doc shouted, crawling up beside us, his medical towel still pulled up over his nose to block the stench of the dead. "If the artillery spotter in the TOC has his headset on, it'll drop him to the floor," Sparks said, his hands already moving. "It's an anomaly. It's a break in the pattern. Any good RTO will immediately call a check fire if their comms board physically shorts out." "Do it," I ordered, pulling my K-bar knife from its sheath and slapping the heavy steel handle into Sparks's palm. "Do it right now." Sparks didn't hesitate. He dropped to his knees in the dust and swung the heavy PRC-77 off his back, letting it slam into the stone floor. He used the razor-sharp edge of my K-bar to slash through the heavy OD green canvas of the battery pouch. He didn't bother unlatching the housing. He just wedged the blade into the seam of the metal casing and pried it open with a violent twist of his wrist. The heavy rectangular battery slid out, hitting the floor with a dull thud. "I need a heat source," Sparks yelled, frantically sawing at the thick black rubber insulation of the main power cables leading from the battery to the radio chassis. "I need something that burns hot enough to fuse the copper and trigger the chemical runaway. A lighter won't do it." I reached down to my combat webbing, my fingers tearing at the snap of my survival pouch. I pulled out a standard issue MK13 Mod 0 marine smoke and illumination signal. It was a metal tube, about the size of a flare, designed to produce orange smoke on one end and a blindingly bright, incredibly hot magnesium flare on the other. "Will this work?" I asked, shoving the metal tube into his hands. Sparks grabbed it, his eyes scanning the igniter cap. "Magnesium. It burns at 4,000 degrees. Yeah, it'll work. But when this battery goes critical, it's going to vent toxic gas, and the flare is going to blind us. You need to get back." "Just wire the damn thing," I yelled. Outside, the deep sub-audible vibration returned to the rock beneath our boots. It was a sensation that bypassed the ears entirely and settled directly into the gut. The second ranging round had just left the tube at the firebase. We had less than 20 seconds before it impacted. Sparks stripped the rubber insulation away, exposing the thick, braided copper wires of the positive and negative leads. He twisted the copper strands together, his fingers bleeding from the sharp wire edges, and jammed the exposed metal directly into the chemical ignition port of the MK13 flare. "Doc! Rook! Sully! Heads down!" Eyes closed. I screamed, throwing myself backward over the rotting legs of Vagabond's point man and dragging Doc down with me. Sparks ripped the protective plastic cap off the flare. He grabbed the metal pull ring, wrapped the copper wire tight around his fist to keep the connection secure, and yanked the ring hard. For a fraction of a second, nothing happened. Then, the inside of the cavern was consumed by the sun. The magnesium flare ignited with a brilliant, searing white light that instantly burned through my closed eyelids. The heat was immediate and punishing, washing over us like the open door of a blast furnace. The shadows of the dead men were thrown stark and sharp against the cave walls, dancing violently in the strobing, unnatural daylight. But the light was nothing compared to the sound. The moment the 4,000-degree heat of the magnesium hit the exposed copper wiring, the military-grade battery went into catastrophic thermal runaway. The chemical paste inside the casing boiled instantly. The PRC-77 didn't just transmit, it convulsed. A high-pitched, electronic squeal erupted from the speaker. But it wasn't a normal sound. It was the sound of raw, unfiltered electromagnetic agony. It was a frequency so sharp, so violently loud, that it felt like an ice pick being driven directly through the center of my skull. It drowned out the monsoon. It drowned out the chorus of my own voice. It drowned out the ghost of bones. The radio casing buckled, the metal warping and turning black as the internal components literally melted into slag. A thick, acrid cloud of white, chemical smoke billowed up to the ceiling, smelling of burning plastic, ozone, and toxic battery acid. Sparks threw himself backward, scrambling away from the blinding light and the sputtering, melting box of metal, coughing violently as the smoke filled the confined space. We lay there in the dust, blinded, deafened, our lungs burning from the chemical smoke, waiting for the artillery shell to arrive. The agonizing seconds ticked by. 10, 15, 20. The subaudible vibration in the rock grew to a terrifying crescendo. The deep, rushing roar of the 105mm shell, tearing through the sky directly toward our coordinates. I braced every muscle in my body, pressing my face into the dirt, waiting for the blast wave that would finally bring the mountain down on top of us. The roar passed directly overhead, so close I swear I felt the air pressure drop in the cave. But the explosion didn't happen on the ledge. It happened deep in the jungle, hundreds of yards down the valley, far beyond the ridge. The dull, muffled thump of the high explosive round echoed off the canyon walls, entirely harmless. The artillery spotter at the TOC, whoever he was, had heard the squeal. He had heard the agonizing, unnatural feedback loop punch through the jamming. His eardrums were probably bleeding, his comms board was probably smoking, but he had recognized it as a catastrophic anomaly. He had grabbed the physical radio line to the gun pit and screamed for a check fire just as the gunners were adjusting their elevation dials. The second ranging round had gone long, flying harmlessly over the ridge and burying itself in the deep canopy. And then, the most terrifying thing of all happened. The flare burned itself out, plunging the cave back into absolute darkness, save for the weak yellow beam of my dropped flashlight. The PRC-77 on the floor gave one final, wet sizzle of melting plastic and died. And the valley went completely, utterly silent. The jamming stopped. The overlapping chorus of my own voice vanished. The calm, dead voice of Bones narrating our execution ceased to exist. There was no more atmospheric pressure. There was no more unnatural stillness. The invisible dome that had sealed off this gorge from the rest of the world simply evaporated. Slowly, hesitantly, the sounds of the real world filtered back into the cavern. I heard the steady, rhythmic patter of the monsoon rain hitting the mud outside. I heard the distant, rolling rumble of natural thunder. And, from somewhere deep in the dark canopy below us, I heard the sharp, screeching call of a macaque monkey. The jungle had returned. The entity, the mimic, the geographic anomaly, deprived of the radio frequency it was using to interface with us, blinded by the massive electromagnetic spike, had let us go. Or perhaps it had simply lost interest, retreating back into the bedrock of the valley to wait for the next patrol to wander into its dead zone. I pushed myself up onto my knees, my muscles trembling so violently I could barely support my own weight. The air in the cave was thick and toxic, a horrific mixture of battery acid, magnesium smoke, and the heavy, sweet rot of Team 1 X-ray. "Sound off," I gasped, my throat raw and burning. "Doc's up," came a weak cough from the corner. "Rook, I'm good." "Sully, I'm okay." I crawled over to Sparks. He was sitting against the wall, staring blankly at the smoking, melted puddle of metal and plastic that used to be his radio. His glasses were cracked, his face covered in soot and red mud. I reached out and gripped his shoulder, squeezing hard. "You did it, kid," I whispered, the adrenaline slowly draining out of my system, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. "You broke the net. You saved our lives." Sparks just nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving the destroyed radio. He was a comms guy. He knew what it meant to be disconnected in the deep jungle. We had no radio. We had no way to call for extraction. We were 15 clicks from the border, surrounded by hostile territory, and we were completely alone. But we were alive. We couldn't stay in the cave. The smell was unbearable, and the structural integrity of the roof was compromised from the first artillery strike. We spent the next 20 minutes doing the hardest, most sickening job an infantryman ever has to do. We moved among the bodies of our friends. We didn't have body bags, and we couldn't carry 6 dead men down a 45-degree mudslide in a monsoon. We took their dog tags. We took their letters from home, carefully sealing them in waterproof map cases. We took their unit patches. And then, we left them there, sitting in their defensive perimeter, holding the line in the dark. I stood over Bones for a long moment, I looked at the shredded remnants of his uniform, the blackened decay of his face. He had taken my place on this patrol. He had died in this cave, while I was sitting in a dry hooch, nursing a fever. And then, whatever lived in this valley had stolen his voice, wearing his dying moments like a mask to try and drag me down into the dark with him. I reached out, unlaced his left boot, and slipped the metal dog tag off the chain. I put it in my breast pocket, right over my heart, and turned away. The exfiltration took 3 days. Without a radio, we had to walk out. We descended the ridge, navigating the treacherous mudslides and the dense bamboo thickets, moving entirely by compass and map. We didn't speak. We didn't rest, except to collapse in the mud for a few hours of exhausted, shivering sleep in the freezing rain. We moved like ghosts, avoiding trails, avoiding clearings, our eyes constantly scanning the canopy, our ears straining against the ambient noise of the jungle. But the valley didn't try to stop us. It remained just a valley. The terrifying, oppressive silence never returned. We heard birds. We heard insects. We heard the wind. The anomaly was gone. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, we broke through the tree line near a river crossing and stumbled into a mechanized infantry patrol out of a neighboring firebase. They almost shot us. We looked like corpses, covered in mud, our uniforms torn to shreds, our eyes hollow and sunken into our skulls. When they realized we were Americans, they called in a dust-off bird. I remember sitting on the aluminum floor of the Huey as it lifted above the canopy, looking down at the endless rolling ocean of green. I held the 6 sets of dog tags in my hand, the metal clinking softly over the roar of the rotors. I didn't feel relief. I didn't feel victory. I just felt a cold, empty void, where my understanding of the world used to be. The debriefing at the TOC was exactly what I expected it to be. Captain Caldwell sat behind his field desk, looking even older and more exhausted than before. He listened to my report in complete silence. He listened to my account of the perfectly clean transmissions, the slashed rucksack that proved the team had been dead for 5 days, the audio of the firefight, and the sheer impossibility of the radio in the cave being functional. When I finished, he didn't call me a liar. He didn't tell me I was crazy. He just opened a manila folder, took out a pen, and began to write the official military reality into existence. The official after-action report concluded that Team 1 X-Ray had been ambushed and killed on the day of their insertion by a highly trained, specialized North Vietnamese Army psychological operations unit. The NVA had captured the team's codebooks and their PRC-77 radio. Over the next 5 days, they had meticulously studied the patrol logs, learned our call signs, and interrogated the dying men for personal details, including my nickname. The report stated that the NVA had then used sophisticated, vehicle-mounted broadcasting equipment, likely staged across the border in Cambodia, to perfectly mimic Bones's voice, utilizing tape recordings and skilled English-speaking operatives. The audio of the firefight was classified as a pre-recorded tape loop designed to bait the rescue team into an artillery trap, exploiting the rigid protocols of the American command structure. As for the smashed radio we found in the cave, the report simply stated that the NVA had left a broken decoy to confuse us before retreating into the jungle. It was a brilliant, logical, completely rational explanation. It fit perfectly into the tactical framework of the Vietnam War. It was an explanation that the generals in Saigon could understand, an explanation that could be filed away in an intelligence archive without threatening anyone's sanity. But Caldwell knew it was a lie. I saw it in his eyes when he handed me the report to sign. He knew that the NVA didn't have the technology to broadcast a signal from the bottom of a dead zone without static. He knew that no tape recorder could see the red mud washing over a point man's boot in real time. I signed the paper. There was no point in arguing. You can't court-martial a valley. You can't drop napalm on a ghost. Doc requested a transfer to a rear-echelon hospital ship a week later. He never spoke to me about the cave again. Sparks finished his tour, but he refused to carry a radio for the rest of his time in country. He became a rifleman, preferring the honest, mechanical reliability of an M16 over the terrifying, invisible world of radio frequencies. I stayed in the LRRPs. I finished my tour, and then I signed on for another. I spent years walking through the deep jungles, hunting the enemy, surviving ambushes, and navigating the darkest corners of that war. But I never went back to the Valley of Parrots. For decades, I tried to accept the official story. I tried to convince myself that I had just been the victim of a brilliant, cruel enemy deception. It was easier to believe that human beings were capable of that level of calculated malice than it was to believe that the earth itself was awake and hungry and learning how to speak. But a few years ago, a buddy of mine who works in the National Archives got his hands on some declassified reel-to-reel tapes from the MACV communications bunkers in the Central Highlands. He knew I had been the team leader for 2 Alpha during the Vagabond incident, and he sent me a digitized copy of the audio logs from that night. I sat in my living room staring at the computer screen and listened to the transmissions again. I heard the chorus of my own voice screaming for the fire mission to be aborted. I heard the chaotic, deafening roar of the phantom firefight. And I heard Bones calling the Broken Arrow. With modern audio software, my buddy had been able to isolate the background noise behind Bones's panicked voice. He had run a spectrogram analysis on the audio, separating the frequencies of the machine gun fire, the screams, and the explosions. He sent me an email with the results. It was just a few sentences, but they are the reason I still wake up in cold sweats, staring at the ceiling, listening to the static of the digital clock on my nightstand. The explosions in the background of Bones's transmission, the deep, concussive thumps that rattled the microphone while he begged for artillery support, were not random noise. The software had matched the acoustic signature of those explosions with absolute, undeniable certainty. They were the exact acoustic signatures of 105mm high-explosive artillery shells detonating in a confined rock space. But Bones had made that transmission 5 days before Captain Caldwell ever authorized the fire mission. He had made that transmission before the artillery battery at the firebase had even loaded the guns. The valley had not just recorded the death of my friends. It had not just recorded the past. The anomaly, the mimic in the dark, existed outside of our understanding of time. When Bones and his team were backed into that cave, fighting for their lives, the valley hadn't just used their voices. It had reached forward, days into the future, and pulled the sound of our own artillery strike back through time, weaving it into the recording of their slaughter. It had built the trap using the inevitable outcome of the trap itself. The military can classify it as psyops. They can blame the NVA. They can bury the coordinates in a sealed archive in Washington. But I know the truth. Out there in the Central Highlands, near the Cambodian border, there is a deep, triple canopy gorge where the rain falls continuously, and the canopy blocks out the sun. And somewhere in the dark, buried beneath tons of collapsed basalt and rotting vines, the airwaves still belong to whatever learned to speak in the voices of the dead. I'm writing this down because somebody needs to. Because Bones deserves more than a paragraph in a sealed file. Because every time I close my eyes, I still hear that whisper, calm, measured, perfectly clear, saying my name. And I know that the valley is still there, still listening, still learning. And if you're reading this, and you've been somewhere like that, somewhere the rules bent, somewhere the radio knew things it shouldn't have known, you already believe me. You don't need the proof. You just need to know that you were never crazy.